We're going to be talking about preparedness for future prosperity, water scarcity, and emergency planning. And so this session was put together by the organizing committee with the aim of addressing all of our conference themes, including being prepared, working together, and creating change. And so our speakers are going to go through some PowerPoints and then give us advice on drought and emergency planning with a focus on the benefits of collaboration and inclusive planning, the importance of planning ahead, considering future climate conditions, and how people can think differently about emergency and drought planning. So I'll just introduce our first speaker. Nicola Lewin is a senior manager in the Land and Adaptation Strategies section at EPCOR. She has a Master's of Science in Civil and Environmental Engineering from the U of A, where she specialized in water and wastewater treatment. Nicola has worked in the water and wastewater industry for 23 years and led teams in operations, engineering, emergency management, and planning. She's currently a senior manager in water planning at EPCOR Utilities and leads the Land and Adaptation Strategies team. She's also a member of the Canadian Water and Wastewater Association Climate Change Committee, chair of the Western Canada section of the American Water and Wastewater Association, Membership and Engagement Committee, and recently became co-chair of the Alberta Water Council's Drought Mutual Support Committee. Nicola is an original member of EPCOR's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council and one of the founding members of Her Story, a Women in Leadership Employee Resource Group. Please welcome Nicola.
Thank you very much, Kara. Thank you. And thanks for inviting me to be here today. I'm very excited to be here and to share what we're doing at EPCOR and in the climate adaptation world, if you will. Before I get started on my presentation, I just do want to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory, as well as the historical regional homeland of Métis, which includes the North Saskatchewan River Territory, the Lesser Slave Lake Territory, and the Lower Athabasca Territory. We acknowledge and respect the histories, languages, and diverse cultures of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and are grateful for their contributions that continue to enrich our communities. And with that, I'll start on my presentation. So like Kara said, my name is Nicola Lewin. I've been with EPCOR for almost 24 years now. My background is I am an engineer by trade, but I worked at the water treatment plants in Edmonton for all 24 years. So a lot of that time spent in operations. Now I am on the planning side of the company and learning lots about how we're adapting to a changing climate at EPCOR. I do want to share some simple tricks and tips and tricks with you all at the end of my presentation around what you can do to adapt in your own home and around your own property to the changing climate. Oh, is it not working? Okay. So just to give you a background about EPCOR and where we're located. So the map on the right shows the city of Edmonton. We have two water treatment plants in the city of Edmonton, the Rossdale Water Treatment Plant, which is located in the middle of the city. You can kind of see it there. It's the yellow star in the center of the map. And then we have the E.L. Smith Water Treatment Plant, which is the larger of the two water treatment plants on the edge of the city. The North Saskatchewan River does run kind of diagonally through the city, running from E.L. Smith and towards Rossdale and towards the northeast there. We do have about 2.5 days of storage within the city. So we have about 11 reservoirs scattered throughout the city, holding about 2.5 days of storage within them. We withdraw about 2% of the North Saskatchewan River flow at the 2 water treatment plants, and we do replace most of that at the 2 wastewater treatment plants that are within the Edmonton region. Yeah, and then there's a breakdown on the slide there of the consumption for the different residential, multi-res, and commercial customers. And you'll see we do have 28% of the water that we produce goes to our regional customers. So we not only provide drinking water to the city of Edmonton, but also outside of Edmonton as well. And so this here just shows the service area. So we provide water within Edmonton, which is kind of the yellow area on the slide there. And then you can see the far reaches that we do send the water to. So it ends up being about 1.5 million customers that we service. So in terms of climate, the long-term climate forecast predicts that Edmonton will see hotter temperatures and more precipitation than average. With these changes, we expect to have more frequent heat waves, as we have definitely been seeing in the last few years. Early spring runoff and earlier spring, and then muted spring runoffs and heavy rainfall events as well. Changes to the precipitation patterns will lead to heavy rainfall events that cause more localized flooding in the region. We don't expect to see drought, river drought. It's not anticipated. In fact, as you can see on this graph, which I do want to acknowledge Dr. Dave Sachin, who did create this for us. A lot of work and a lot of data went into creating this graph. But what it shows is the lighter blue on the graph is the future prediction of flow in the North Saskatchewan River, and the dark blue is baseline or kind of current state. As you can see from the graph, there's a shift. So you have earlier higher flows in the river. So because of the warmer temperatures, spring's coming earlier, and then we do see a bit of an increase as well in flow on the river. And I guess the only other thing I wanted to mention on this particular slide is that, you know, your region, every region is going to be different. This is very specific to the Edmonton region and the North Saskatchewan River. But doing these long-range analysis really do help in your long-term planning and climate adaptation planning. Okay. Another thing that we do is we do monitor the watershed quite closely. So this is a picture here that shows the North Saskatchewan River watershed upstream of Edmonton. There are 19 monitoring stations on the river and on the creeks that flow into the river. And there's 16 cameras on those as well. These stations provide advance warning to our operations during river ice breakup, spring runoff. Water quality can be quite poor. So this does provide early warning when those conditions are happening. The stations also provide snowpack, river level, and flow information. And right now, and you can see the graph in the corner there, that's a typical graph that you would get from one of these monitoring stations. And kind of the dotted line shows the upper and lower quartile of flow within the North Saskatchewan River. What we're seeing right now is the green line going through the graph. And right now we're at 82% of average flow on the North Saskatchewan River. And you can see that it still is between that. So we still do have a healthy supply of water in our river. And the red line actually shows the low flow conditions. So we're nowhere near that. We're nowhere near that right now. However, we do expect to see higher temperatures within the Edmonton region, especially those heat waves in the summer, like we've been seeing in the past few years. And those do cause supply issues. So when we have, of course, the long hot summers, very dry, demand increases. And we're not able at the water treatment plants to keep up with that demand. So in those scenarios, we are going to have to call demand management measures. And so really in Edmonton, what we're facing is not necessarily a river supply issue, but it's more of a water treatment supply scenario. So we do have three tiers of demand management within EPCOR. We've had that since the 1980s. We've reviewed it many times over. And the three levels that we have are demand management measure A, which is purely operational and internal to EPCOR. So what can we do internally to reduce our water usage, reduce the pressure of our system to get about 2% reduction in demand? Then there's a level B measure, which is more voluntary. And there we're targeting 5% reduction in demand. And that's when we have to go externally and ask customers to reduce their water usage on a voluntary basis, go to the even odd lawn watering, that sort of thing. And then demand management measure C is when we have to go to a more stringent mandatory level of demand management. And we're looking for a 10% reduction in water. And it doesn't sound like a lot of reduction, but it really does have a big impact and really does help. And one thing I forgot to mention, actually, the North Saskatchewan River is under allocated right now. We're only 25% allocated on the North Saskatchewan River withdraw. I know it's very different from what we're seeing in Southern Alberta, where the rivers in Southern Alberta are 100% allocated. So again, we're in a bit of a different situation when it comes to the river in that regard as well. So what we're doing to build resiliency at EPCOR, we have a lot of projects on the go actually to address resiliency during our changing climate. One, we do have flood protection projects at both of our water treatment plants. Both the water treatment plants are in the river valley, and so they're susceptible to river flooding. So we are building, have projects to protect them from river flood. We also have a number of stormwater projects underway to protect from urban flooding. And so building things like dry ponds, wet ponds, low impact developments, building out that green infrastructure around the city to help us, and especially in, those higher risk flood areas, really to help reduce the city's urban flood risk. We do have a home flood protection and inspection program and a rebate to go along with that. And that's all information on our website. And so I'm happy to share anything on that if anyone's interested. Supporting the province's drought resiliency planning. That's something we haven't been focused on ourselves. We have been more focused on flood because that was a bigger risk to our utility. But we are developing drought resiliency planning as well. And we have a climate adaptation strategy, which we are reviewing currently. We do have a number of partners and collaborations that are underway. A lot of projects with different stakeholders and partners. One thing, the monitoring stations that were on the watershed, those were that project was led by Alberta Environment, but we were at the table along with the City of Edmonton and another North Saskatchewan River Watershed Alliance. We were all there, collaborating and determining where the location of those stations should be and that sort of thing. So a lot of really good partnerships, also demand management measures. When we review those, we do that collaboratively. We talk with the City of Edmonton. We have to talk to our regional customers because it really does impact everybody. And lastly, some simple things you can do. Just some things here that wanted to mention. One easy thing is rain barrels. You know, the rainwater that falls from your roof, collecting it and storing it on your property as much as possible is a really great thing to do, especially if we are in a heat wave. We have to reduce call water demand management measures. You'll have that water on supply in your yard to water your plants and that sort of thing. On a conservation side, interestingly, in the city of Edmonton, we've actually, despite a growing population, the water use trends per capita have not increased since the late 1980s, which is due to conservation measures that have been put in place, like low flush toilets and appliances, that sort of thing. So that's really great. But I'm sure there's more we can do. And there's simple things like turning off the water when you're brushing your teeth and that sort of thing. Every drop really does count, especially in those, you know, what I like to call urban drought situations where we have to call like a demand management measure. And then here's a few other things that you can do, maybe not quite as simple as on the other side, but, you know, rain gardens, building a rain garden in a low-lying area. There's lots of information on the website, how to build those. Permeable pavements, that's really a great way to replace concrete pads that may be falling apart. Anything we can do to make our city greener is an excellent way of combating climate change impacts. And I think that might be the end. Yes. Thank you very much.
So keep track of your questions for all our panelists, and then we'll save time at the end. So I'll introduce our next speaker. Andre Aslin is the Executive Director of both the Alberta Water Council and the Clean Air Strategic Alliance. Andre is born and raised in Edmonton, where he completed a French high school diploma and earned a Bachelor of Science in Environment Conservation Science, specializing in environmental economics and policy, and pursued graduate studies in resource economics, both at the University of Alberta. He developed a close relationship with nature, spending summers outdoors, hiking in Alberta's beautiful Rocky Mountains or lakeside at the family cabin. He began working with the Alberta Water Council as a project manager in 2010 and progressively took on greater responsibilities. And in 2017 was named Executive Director of both the Water Council and the Clean Air Strategic Alliance. He likes golfing, cooking, and I don't know about this last line, if this is going to go over well with everyone here, and watching the Oilers push to win the Stanley Cup. Okay, Andre.
Yeah, I'll give you a second on that one. Even higher, yeah. Yeah, there you go. Okay, cool, thanks. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Kara. It's lovely to meet a fellow CASA, former ED. For those of you who didn't know, Kara was the former ED of the organization that I now lead. And so it's a very small world in environmental management. And I think today everyone in this room just proves that. Just to touch on Nicola's presentation a little bit, I got a rain barrel, but I didn't get the one that's easy to use. And so it's been sitting in my garage for 2.5 years. So if you get one, make sure it's easy to install and use, and then you might actually use it. I'd like to thank ClimateWest for inviting me to speak today, and glad that we have such great turnout in the room. Climate adaptation and resilience is only going to get more important as we move forward. So very timely, and I hope we have many more of these. The theme today for the conference is for working together and building resiliency. And so I'm here to tell you about some of the work that the Alberta Water Council has done, as well as tell you about the organization itself related specifically to drought and the reason for why we took that work on. So about the Water Council, we came out of the Water for Life strategy, which was released in 2003. It's the Alberta provincial leading water management strategy. One thing that was unique about that strategy when it started was that it focused on a need for partnerships to work together, and also that it was watershed based. And that was unique at the time. And one of the partnerships that was deemed necessary was a provincial level body that was multi-stakeholder in membership and tried to seek consensus or worked to reach consensus on decisions to address provincial scale water management issues. So the way I describe this to people is that we've got issues that affect multiple sectors and users across multiple watersheds. That's the kind of work that we do. There's other groups that are more regionally focused or watershed focused, but we take on the sort of higher level policy issues, or we're providing advice to the government when they're asking for it, or we're helping develop tools that can be used across the province. We're a collaborative partnership of 23 members that I'll show you on the next slide. And we focus on the interests to reach those consensus decisions, not the positions. So it's a process whereby people come to the table with the expectation that we're going to fix a problem, and we all have different problems with this problem. And the best way to do that is to put ourselves in each other's shoes, because the best deal for the person across the table is also the best deal for me. And you do that with 23 members, and you get a pretty resilient solution to some pretty complicated problems. We are funded by the government of Alberta. Core operations are anyways. So just wanted to point that out as well, because some people like to know where the money's coming from. So, oh no. Oh no. Okay. It looks like this on my page, and basically lines out that we've got 4 sector groups. Okay, we've got industry, and we've got NGOs, and we have government of Alberta and provincial authorities, and then other levels of government, all with a seat at the table. And so we've got a broad diversity of organizations. They all represent a significant segment of civil society. So think forestry, irrigation, oil and gas, mining, livestock. We've got the wetland conservation sector. So Ducks Unlimited sits at my table, along with Trout Unlimited and the Alberta Lake Management Society. And we've got general environmental interests that are selected from the Alberta Environmental Network that all contribute. They all sit at the table. They all come talk to each other. And then various departments of government, and then municipal governments as well. So the way I describe the work that we try to do is imagine 23 circles, a Venn diagram, and there's one little spot in the middle. And that's where we try to go. We try to find that sweet spot for everyone on a variety of topics, but today I'm going to focus on drought. Oh, that was the slide. Nice work, guys. Nice work. All right. At a high level, we support the outcomes of the Water for Life strategy. We provide advice that informs policy or actions, and provide a forum to discuss water management issues, right? If you don't have a table where everyone's familiar coming together and talking and discussing these issues, it's really hard to build that from scratch on a single issue that you need to address. So that's why we exist. So the first project I'll talk about has to do with building resilience to drought. And I wanted to point out that, why do we deal with drought? And I found a great quote today. It's from a Canadian, Dr. James P. Bruce, who said, "If climate change is a shark, then water is its teeth." And it's true. We will feel the impacts of climate change through the impacts of water, whether it be too much water and floods, or the timing of water where we're not used to getting it, or drought, long severe periods of drought, including multi-decadal droughts that we've had in Alberta in the past. A lot of people don't realize that the last 120 years or so of data that we have in Alberta was relatively wet. So we have a much drier future, if you, even just looking at historic norms. And so what climate change will do to that, we're not entirely sure. But droughts have devastating impacts on economic, social, and environmental aspects of our lives. It's unavoidable. We're going to be seeing more of it. And for us, for me anyways, resiliency in the frame of my work means planning. So the more you can plan for it, the better you can adapt to it and respond to it, and then recover from it. And that's really big impacts of important aspects of drought. All right. So I'll talk about 3 projects we've done, and hopefully I can get through the time. I know I tend to talk a lot, but we'll see what we can do. So the first thing we did was develop a guide to build resiliency to multi-year drought. This was a project that was brought to us by the Watershed Planning and Advisory Councils of Alberta. So these are groups that are watershed level organizations, also multi-stakeholder, that do things like state of the environment reporting. They do planning, a lot of education and outreach within their watersheds. And they said, we need a tool to help municipalities develop drought resistance plans. Now, drought resistance plans are sometimes tied in with climate adaptation plans. So it all kind of fits. And this is just the slice of the pie that we tried to take on and do, because you can't take everything on at once. You've got to take manageable bites. So we went with this one. And what we did is we brought everyone together and did a literature review and pulled together a guide to help go step by step what a municipality would have to do to develop a drought plan, and also workshop materials so that the WPACs could host workshops and bring municipal leaders in to get their buy-in, get their information, because ultimately decision makers need to know this stuff if they're going to push the resources towards adapting to these issues. Very glad that we released the deliverables in January 2021. Now, if you were to put out a project that said, here's how you host in-person workshops, and then you had a pandemic declared, 8 months, or you got it done and the pandemic was declared, you kind of run into a problem there of hosting these workshops. So unfortunately, we didn't get to the workshops starting to be delivered until fall of last year, very recent. Now, timing wise, that's great for us. We look great because we've put out a resource that will help municipalities develop drought response plans. And so the drought was, I don't want to say well timed because that's a horrible thing to say, but we were lucky to have this resource in place. And I don't know, did anybody hear about workshops? They were only in Alberta, but did anybody hear about workshops from the WPACs? Good amount of hands, okay, not bad. So it means we've done some good work and we'll keep doing more work. Excellent. So this is just a list of the different management themes that we identified that would go into a drought management plan. And the beauty about this guide is that even though it was developed in Alberta, these themes are universal. They apply to any ecosystem, any region. Even if it was in the States, you would still be able to apply these things, even though the governance systems are a bit different. And each one of these actually depends largely on collaboration and planning. And it all leads to, and because you got to work together to do it, because you're all impacted by it. What's the old saying? Everyone's downstream of someone and we're all upstream of someone. So we're all in it together. Okay, I'm going to keep going here. When we did the first project, we realized that there was a draft management plan for Alberta that was in the works. And they realized that it would be really great if we could sit everybody in a room and simulate a drought. I said, what would we do? What would actually happen? And so I was happy to hear, I think it was, is it Jill from Resilient Rurals? The idea of doing mock exercises is extremely helpful. So if you're involved in this, if you're a decision maker, find some examples and you can look up this report because it'll tell you exactly what we did to simulate a drought. And ironically, we simulated the exact drought that we're going through right now. And so the idea was to test that drought response plan amongst the water managers and stakeholders that would be impacted in the 3 sub-basins of the South Saskatchewan River that are currently under threat and currently have water sharing agreements in them. We did this, we brought all the major water users together, all the big licensees, so the cities, the industries, agriculture, and a couple other groups that you wouldn't think that actually do hold water licenses. And group them together at a watershed level and then stress the system. Okay, so we actually exceeded the level of drought that we're at right now. We went all the way to stage 5 and tested the responses. And what do you do? What do you do? Holy crap, who do you call? Does anybody know? No, so you have to get people in the room and you have to, you realize that, oh God, I need a telephone tree, right? Because otherwise, so it's something basic. So you have this nice plan on paper and you got some boxes and some arrows, but to tangibly go through the exercise was incredibly helpful. It's funny because one of the things that came out of that whole process was that some people who had been doing this for their whole lives were not aware that water sharing agreements are an option and there was no information on them. And so we happened to release this report in February 2024, but the simulation was June 2022, which means that all of the learnings had already sort of been baked in and government was ready and knew all the weaknesses as we went into this 3rd year of severe drought. So the timing was absolutely fantastic for us. We look great as a water council and really glad to see that we've got water sharing agreements that have come out of it. And so I got to observe that process. I'm not going to talk about it, but if anybody has questions, feel free to ask. How am I doing on time? A few minutes more? Awesome. Ooh, 5 minutes, that's lots. All right. I'm going to shift to another project that we did, and this is a long-term project that we started back in 2006. And it's to meet one of the targets of the Water for Life strategy, which was a lofty goal of improving water use efficiency and productivity by 30% from 2005 to 2015. That's a lofty goal. Some people say it was based on a projection of population increase and economic increase over the time. And some people just said 30% sounds like a good number. Let's just pluck that out of the air and go for it. So the Water Council took on this work, and through 4 project teams, these are the 7 major water using sectors in Alberta. And that's almost in order of how, of decreasing order of use. And so that represents well over 90% of all the licensed allocated water in Alberta. So these sectors came around the table, and through 4 teams and 15 years, developed plans with multi-stakeholder support and NGO input of some kind. There was different options for each sector to do it. Each sector is different. Developed a framework that they all followed, developed performance metrics that we all agreed to, and they all are reporting on right now. Developed the plans, implemented them. And then in 2017, we evaluated the progress. So it was tough to do because all different sectors have all different metrics. And then we just did another 5-year implementation update recently in October. So we're just pulling together that final report, and that should be available soon. And we were looking at things like the Water for Life goals and key directions. So that's safe, secure drinking water and healthy aquatic ecosystems and reliable supplies for a sustainable economy. And also some other pieces. So CEP desired outcomes was that either efficiency or productivity went up, or that we left the same amount of water in the river while making more stuff, and sector-specific targets based on their very unique needs. Now, how hard would it be to add up how many barrels of oil, how many tons of pulp, how many megawatts of power, how many kilograms of crops, and how much gas was, like gasoline, was produced? That was our challenge. And I think when they picked the target of 30%, they thought, great, should be easy. No, try and add that up. It takes a really long time to figure out and sort out how to do it. And in the end, we nailed it. The sectors around the table, through a voluntary process with multi-stakeholder support, compared to a business as usual scenario, used 32% less water. Voluntarily. Industry came together and did this voluntarily, okay? And if there's one thing that I know came out of this, is that it really raised the profile of water use and the cost of water to industry. And that was one of the pieces that really jumped out. All of a sudden, people are thinking, okay, water's free, but I have to pump it, I have to clean it, I have to use it, I have to clean it again, and then I have to pump it back in the river. Every single drop that they have to use costs them money. And it's, so I know it's nice to say, oh, we're all in this together and everything. If you can prove the dollar value, that gets things moving. I'll share briefly about the water sharing agreements. I won't go deep into it, but essentially in the fall of last year, Government of Alberta started conversations with the large licensees because we knew that the projections for water availability this coming season were going to be very tight for another year in a row. We kind of call the reservoirs that we have in Alberta the insurance policy. So if you burn through your insurance policy, your next year, if it's dry again, you're in trouble. And that's where we are this year. So that's why the government started these negotiations on water sharing agreements. And we've got 4 separate agreements that are live, and they're being reported on right now in the 4 southern watersheds in the south. They're voluntary MOUs that include all the large licensees, but they are asking smaller licensees and those who aren't part of the agreements to also conserve water. And the high level of it is that if these agreements are enacted. Okay, so everyone's agreed to them, but they haven't been enacted. If things go badly and need to be enacted, municipalities will be asked to reduce water use by 5 to 10%. Industrial users will be asked to use the minimum amount of water necessary for production, and then the irrigation districts get the rest. And they're already looking at less than half of their typical allocation for irrigation districts. Usually they're allowed 18 acre inches per year, and most of them are allocating at 8 right now. So everyone's on board, pulling on the same rope, trying to get through this. Here's a summary slide, but I'm over time. There you go. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andre. Whoa, it's all the way up here. All right, thanks. Well, thanks, Sam. Oh, just give it a second. Thank you. Okay, so let me introduce our next speaker. Emmeline Marshall-Hill is an independent consultant based in British Columbia, specializing in emergency management and governance. With a focus on serving Indigenous, municipal, regional, and provincial entities, Emmeline is dedicated to finding practical solutions to complex challenges. Her role as the Housing Branch Director for the Grand Forks-Kootenay Boundary Flood Recovery, Emmeline led efforts to develop collaborative visions and plans, bringing diverse groups together to achieve common goals in housing recovery. Her commitment to inclusivity and resilience extends to advocating for the all-of-society approach emphasized in the Sendai framework. With a humble approach and unwavering dedication, Emmeline continues to make meaningful contributions to emergency management, inspiring others to work together towards a safer future. Welcome, Emmeline.
Thanks for adjusting it after Andre. I've written some notes because I only have so much time and I really want to get a few things across to the audience. It's always nice for an emergency manager to have a chance to explain what emergency management actually is. What I'm doing is giving you a common language to talk about the topic at hand, which for this panel is water. But this framework applies to all hazards, so keep that in mind. We need to assess risks to understand what could happen and how it will impact us. Let's consider water risk, the drinking aspect. How long would you last without clean drinking water? That's an emergency right there. But water is also used for businesses like hotels, restaurants, oil and gas, industries that you have here. Water is a friend, but it can be a foe as well. Flash floods, extreme heavy rainfall, freshet. This is where emergency management steps in. We identify risks and we take action. And let's all agree that none of our words mean anything unless somebody takes action. Let me share a bit about my background. I've received extensive training in risk and emergency management. I have first-hand experience in disaster recovery in a major flood event, and I'm also recognized on a provincial list for recovery manager services in British Columbia. What I value is building collaborative relationships across different areas. I've broken new ground in cross-jurisdictional and multi-jurisdictional emergency management organizations because, as Brett, our keynote speaker, said yesterday, ecosystems don't care about borders. Well, neither do emergencies. But beyond personal achievements, it's about serving something bigger than myself. I'm drawn to this profession because I have a deep-seated desire to help others in their time of need and to ensure the safety of our first responders out on the front lines. It's about being there for our communities during their toughest moments and making a meaningful difference in people's lives. So now you know, I'm not just a pretty face. Before we begin, I'd like to outline 3 key points for you to keep in mind throughout this presentation. I'll also revisit them at the end. Consider the following. Think about. Reflect on how these concepts apply to your organization or personal life. Ask about. Identify any questions you have or items to your to-do list and implement. Consider what actions you'll take based on the information you've received. This presentation speaks to everyone, not just organizations, but individuals as well. Take a broad view, and I promise that you will get something out of this risk management and emergency management framework. Let's start by highlighting past disasters in Alberta, such as the Bow River flood, Fort Mac wildfire, and others related to drought. Moving on to critical infrastructure, let's think about the incidents like broken water mains, oil spills, and major rail incidents. From the Fort Mac experience, we've learned valuable lessons, particularly the effectiveness of mitigation. How did we learn that? Because that's what they're doing right now. It's so important to emphasize as well the collaborative response to the Fort Mac wildfire, involving various organizations from search and rescue teams to fire departments located over 150 kilometers away. Let's also consider my experience in Grand Forks, BC, where many organizations played important roles in both response and recovery efforts. Multi-agency coordination was a vital part of that recovery effort. We have learned from experiences elsewhere, and one of those lessons is that recovery needs multiple organizations, and our Recovery Operations Center needed to provide the support that invites organizations to the party, so to speak. Mennonite Disaster Service was one of the first organizations to support our vision for long-term housing recovery. All Grand Forks residents affected by the May 2018 flooding will have options for safe permanent housing suitable to their basic needs with the help of multiple organizations. That was our vision. We understood Mennonite Disaster Services' role in helping uninsured or underinsured households rebuild. So we focused on supporting them in their expertise rather than pushing them to do something else. For instance, we facilitated coordination with regional and municipal permit offices to streamline the permitting process, preventing staff from becoming overwhelmed, especially if multiple projects happened at once. We expedited geotechnical engineering surveys to accommodate construction on different sections of land parcels. This approach allowed Mennonite Disaster Service to effectively apply their experience and resources toward our shared goal of rebuilding Grand Forks. Other agencies that assisted included Samaritan's Purse, Canadian Red Cross, and the Salvation Army. As Housing Branch Director, I learned that it's not just about the wood and nails. Of course, that's a big part of it, but we care about the people who rely on those houses as homes and the psychological benefits of having a home and the pain and trauma of losing a home and everything in it, including the soil out front. Those who have been without a place to live for 12 months in a stress, it's hard to talk about. Those who have been without a place to live for 12 months in a stretch talk of the stress, which may sound vague, but it can be measured in the number of tearful outbursts, the number of visits to the health clinic, the cost of pharmaceuticals, the nights consoling anxious children, the increase in home conflicts, and the loss of jobs. I never forget that while we're managing disasters, we have the daily lives of real people in our care. Whew. This is an easier slide to talk about. To engage more people in emergency management, I sometimes find it helpful to connect it with the broader concept of risk management. This connection engages more people, it prompts deeper thinking, questions, and action. Someone once told me, risk management, you can't go anywhere without getting some of it on you. It really stuck with me because it highlights how risk is always there, shaping our decisions and experiences, whether we realize it or not. We're all risk managers. It's why we're still alive as a species. But not all of us have the language to navigate it. Enter EASM, my key for remembering the steps in risk management. Exposure includes identifying the risks and understanding what could happen. Alternatives include all possible actions that reduce risk. And because risk is measured by probability and consequence, that means actions that could reduce the probability or consequences. This step calls for a full description of each option, including costs. The S in EASM is the selection step, which includes developing a plan. Who does what and how will we pay for it? Then implement and monitor. That's just good project management. And that's what we do in emergency management. Emergency management is just a smaller box in the larger rectangle of risk management, but we apply all those same principles. And emergency management isn't a siloed job. Pieces of emergency management go everywhere throughout an organization. And once they do, we need to organize them. There's my little comic. I have a collection. So let's talk about risk assessment. And I think that this framework might be the most useful slide in my presentation today. The conversation for this panel centers around water. Water risks include drought. When water becomes scarce, it affects everything from agriculture to daily household needs. It's not just about crops, it impacts our entire way of life. Our water systems aren't bulletproof either. Cyber attacks or infrastructure failures can leave us without clean water. Picture a wildfire contaminating a water source with harmful chemicals and particulates. It's a serious threat to public safety. Every community has its own risks, whether it's freshet flooding, dam failures, or industrial accidents. So if any water gets contaminated from any number of these sources, we have a situation. So why do we assess risks? It's about knowing what could go wrong and who's most at risk, who's vulnerable. I also want to mention that when it comes to risk assessments, it's super dangerous to jump on the biggest threat, on what's immediate and apparent. We need to broaden our view to consider all potential hazards. As emergency managers, one of our greatest strengths is we collect stories from around the world and ask the question, could that happen here? And despite the probability of these risks, we must put in reasonable efforts to understand them, to mitigate, and prepare for them. I've seen communities get really good at preparing for one type of disaster, like wildfires, but then they're caught off guard by something else, like mudslides. We need to be ready for whatever comes our way, not just what's happened in the past. What can we do beforehand? That's the mitigation side of things. Number 3. For those of you who don't know, mitigation has 2 different meanings in the field of emergency management and climate. Heather from Environment and Climate Change Canada spoke about mitigation in the context of climate yesterday. In climate fields, and I feel like I'm mansplaining right now, but in climate fields, mitigation cuts emissions to combat climate change, for example, transitioning to renewables. In emergency management, it reduces long-term risks from hazards through measures like building codes and public education. Both aim at reducing risk, but in different domains. Let's apply the emergency management definition of mitigation to a water system example. It's for you too. In Greater Victoria, the regional district gathers water from 3 catchment areas, treats it, distributes it through mains, and delivers it across Greater Victoria to 13 municipalities. In all cases, municipalities purchase bulk water from the regional district and distribute it through smaller mains to individual households. So, when designing water system mitigation, we can imagine that no single jurisdiction has all the replacement parts and resources they need to fix everything. But if we work together, we can figure things out like standard valve types and sizes, so that when a water main breaks, everyone uses the same parts, so we can help each other. Here's a relatable comparison. Think of the years and years of different cell phone chargers where you're constantly looking for a cell phone charger that fits your phone. Wouldn't it be great if we all got together and faced the truth? And that truth is, as 13 municipalities and 1 regional district, back in Greater Victoria, none of us have enough resources to handle a major emergency alone. We must rely on each other. And what I'm hearing is that personnel from one jurisdiction can't help another because they don't have the same training and they don't use the same parts. So let's agree to help each other and standardize our procedures. Consider the scenario of an earthquake in BC. Outside help will be needed, especially to repair water systems. With a clear understanding of the supply chain, we also understand that the regional district will have to repair theirs first. My point here is that no single organization can do it alone. No single organization has all the people, parts, and equipment needed for a major emergency. We will help each other because it's human nature. So let's just make it as easy as possible to do so. When we're talking about critical infrastructure, I'm now on numbers 4, 5, and 6. Plans for response, business continuity, and recovery often get confused. Let's consider a major water main break. When water department operations personnel rush to the scene, dig up the ground to cap the break to keep delivering water, where does this action fit? Is it response? Is it continuity? Is it recovery? I don't know. But this distinction matters, particularly concerning funding. In British Columbia, the province covers 100% of response, they cover 80% of recovery, and they don't fund business continuity at all. In which box do you put a particular action? It's an important question, and we answer this by considering the objectives. In response, our objective is clear. It's to save lives, prevent further damage to the built environment, protect the natural environment, and safeguard the economy. So if our actions align with any of these objectives, we're responding. In recovery, our objective is to rebuild infrastructure in a way that not only restores operations, but puts us in a lower risk environment than we were before. Build back better. Some may refer to this as mitigation. When we rebuild, we have a valuable opportunity to put in mitigation measures. This may be our best chance, maybe our only chance, as it can be very costly to retrofit later. Consider the example of Greater Victoria, where they're opting for steel or ductile iron water pipes instead of what was done in the past, which is an asbestos-laden concrete casing around a thin metal tube. A cost-effective choice at the time. However, concrete breaks down, and of course, during earthquakes, it's fragile. This example highlights the importance of not only restoring things to their previous state in recovery, but building back better. So let's talk about business continuity objectives. Business continuity involves temporary measures taken to maintain essential services during response and recovery efforts, especially regarding water supply. For example, when there was a water main break on McTavish Road in Victoria, the response team needed a week to repair 30 meters of pipe. If it had been a larger break, it could have taken weeks or even months. However, during this time, people still need to receive water, a service they pay for and a service their lives depend on. And that's the core of business continuity, ensuring that vital services continue even after they've been disrupted, both during immediate response efforts and throughout the long-term recovery process. And preparedness. Preparedness comes down to 5 key elements: people, plans, equipment, training, and exercise. First, we need to know the people we have in each phase: response, continuity, and recovery, and clear plans for how and what they're going to do during emergencies, ensuring everybody knows their role. Then we provide the necessary tools, equipment, and facilities for the job, whether it's parts for a water system, a mobile incident command post where you can roll out maps, or a building designated as your emergency operations center. But having people, plans, and equipment is just a start. People need training to use them effectively. And exercise. We must conduct exercises to test our plans, the equipment, and most importantly, to make sure people know each other. Exercises are like the icing on the cake. They make everything come together and ensure our preparedness efforts are truly effective. So kudos to you, Andre, for saying that. I always go back to this objectives framework. Everything in emergency management fits under these objectives. It helps us get organized, so we're doing things that are priorities in the right order. So as we wrap up, I'd like to revisit the 3 key points we discussed earlier. Something to think about, something to ask about, and something to implement. Now that we've delved into the realm of risk and emergency management, I encourage you to reflect on how these concepts apply to your organization or your personal life. Remember that this presentation isn't just about organizations. It's about every single individual in this room, including you and your family. By adopting a proactive and collaborative approach to risk and emergency management, we can better protect ourselves and the people around us. So thank you for your attention and engagement, and let's continue to prioritize safety and resilience in all aspects of our life. I hope that you find this very helpful, because I think often, and I'm going off script here, I get called in to do something like an evacuation plan. And that is before a community even has a risk assessment, not just a list of what the risks are, but how those risks will evolve over time. So the reason I took the time to share a framework with you is I really wanted to communicate that there's a logical flow to how we do things. Work smarter, not harder, and all that, but there's a progression. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Emmeline. I hope you're keeping track of all your questions for our speakers. Okay, and our final speaker in the panel, Dr. Timothy David Clark, is a principal owner at Willow Springs Strategic Solutions, where he oversees and conducts rights, socioeconomic, cultural, and disaster impact assessments, helps to design cumulative effects management systems, and carries out oral and archival historical research. Dr. Clark has worked with and for Indigenous governments and communities in Canada and in South America for the past 2 decades. Please welcome Timothy Clark.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me. This talk is going to be a little bit more philosophical and not at all about water. So I apologize in advance for anyone for whom they're not looking for that. Very briefly about me, my name is Tim. I own a research and consulting company based in Cochrane. We work with and for Indigenous nations, governments, and communities, and that's an important distinction to me. I'll often tell the nations that I work with, and I don't want to let the cat out of the bag, but there's a lot of fat in the consulting industry. And I will often tell the communities that I work with, if you really want to know whether the researchers that you're working with view the research you're doing as a partnership, and a partnership designed to advance the interests and capacity of your nation, look at the budget. That will always tell you how they view the research and how they view the relationship. But I'm not here to talk about how shitty consultants are. I'm here to talk about cumulative effects and disaster. So cumulative effects are most commonly understood, and I think kind of dominated in a sense, by environmental science and an environmental focus, right, on cumulative impacts to the environmental world. While there is a role for this narrow focus, I think, limits our ability to understand the causes and the solutions to cumulative effects. Cumulative effects aren't just environmental. They're social, they're cultural, they're linguistic and knowledge-based, they're economic and political and governance. And so when we focus more narrowly on environmental impacts, we tend to focus more on industry and industrial development, which produces a lot of these environmental impacts. And we miss the bigger cause of cumulative effects, which is governments. The other challenge that I've found in this is that this sort of environmental science perspective, or you could say sort of a Western scientific perspective, often has a very difficult time relating to and communicating with knowledge systems in which our values, how we produce knowledge and how we use knowledge are more tightly integrated, right? And we've developed all sorts of metaphors to address this challenge, right? Two-eyed seeing, all sorts of hair metaphors about braiding and weaving. And these are all good conversations to have. The concern I have about them is that these kind of metaphors can be used to ignore the fact or obscure the fact that the eyes that we see through, the hair that we are braiding, for those who still have some, are connected to a control center that very much shapes how this knowledge is produced and how this knowledge is used. And so long as knowledge production and the use of this knowledge in our country is dominated by the prerogatives of governments, universities, corporations, we can braid and weave till the cows come home. We will never get to the point where we can produce the kind of equitable and sustainable knowledge that can lead us towards a more equitable and sustainable society. So if people ask me what cumulative effects are, and they rarely do, I often answer that cumulative effects are fundamentally the real history of this country. From treaty and its dishonor, the Indian Act, the script system, these are the cumulative effects that have led us to the places where we are today. And this is a theme I'm going to come back to. Who knows better about these cumulative effects than the Indigenous peoples of this country? So when I think about cumulative effects, I don't start with counting the number of pipelines or well pads, looking at the changes in caribou populations over time or socioeconomic inequalities. I try and think about what I think underlies all of that stuff. And when I think about cumulative effects, I think what we're really, really fundamentally talking about is broken relationships. Broken relationships between treaty peoples and governments. We may not want to acknowledge it, but all of our lives, our experiences, our opportunities, our understandings all flow from that in this country. It's broken relationships between people and the lands and waters that we denigrate and contaminate. It's broken relationships between species and ecosystems that have become imbalanced, including our own role within those ecosystems because we exist within them. It's broken relationships between our communities and our families. And it's broken relationships between our ancestors and future generations against whom we are building extraordinary debts, whether those be ecological, financial, sociocultural. You may be wondering how any of this relates to disaster management. And so I have a couple of quick thoughts that I want to share, and I want to leave as much time for conversation as possible. A couple of quick points. All disasters are cumulative effects. And we are going to have a very difficult time properly understanding the origins, the mechanisms, and the management of disasters if we don't have that broader knowledge of cumulative effects and how we arrived at where we are. Where relationships are broken, everything we should do should be about rebuilding those relationships. Context and rights, including treaty rights, constitutional rights, UNDRIP, these all can and should shape our disaster management programs. And finally, know what you don't know. Many of us have developed very complex systems of knowledge in very narrow areas. I never describe myself as an expert in anything. I consider myself to be a person who is groping around in the dark for something that may or may not be there. And at that shift from focusing on what we know to what we don't know, I think is really important to developing the kind of humility that allows us to rebuild those relationships and arrive at a more equitable place. Finally, there's a lot of emphasis from governments, from different institutions about how do we integrate Indigenous knowledge into cumulative effects management, into disaster management, into all of these different areas that we're worried about. I think part of the problem, or part of the reason that we have so many problems with this, that's not the right question. There is a fundamentally colonial mindset there that assumes that there is a non-Indigenous way of understanding this that is superior and into which Indigenous knowledge must fit. Why do we assume that? Why do we reflexively and uncritically assume that the institutions, that the cultural and value systems that have created all of these problems are immediately the ones that we should turn to for answers? And so, you know, something for all of us to think about, I think, is why is it not Canada's responsibility to try and understand how it can fit its understanding into those of the First Peoples of these lands? What would that look like if we seriously tried? And all of us as non-Indigenous peoples, what would it look like if we tried to take our knowledge and our experience and fit that into a different way of understanding? To me, that is so much more enriching. And if you want to start talking about building a broader understanding, that is so much more valuable than getting another postgrad or another professional certification. And so that's just a final thought for all of us to contemplate. And that is it. Thank you very much.
Wow, okay, great. Thank you all so much. We are just going to go straight into questions. Either in the room, feel free to go up to the mic, or put your questions into Mentimeter. And we do have about 20 minutes, so hopefully we can get to some of them here. Okay. I'm going to give people a chance to put some of their questions in for the last couple speakers. And so I was going to ask you a question. Not all of you have to answer, but you all talked about collaboration in some form, like partnerships, bringing people around the table to make plans, working with your neighboring municipalities, repairing broken relationships. Do you have an example of something that worked really well? Like one project you could think of, one meeting you can think of where somehow people came together and you just observed how collaboration really helped achieve the goals of either the emergency plan or the drought plan or repairing relationships. Open to any of you if you want to take a crack at what has worked well. Do you have an example of what's worked well?
Awesome, this works. So the project I mentioned about water conservation, efficiency, and productivity is the best example that I have for partnerships working together, or for people coming together to achieve a common goal. And I think what was unique about that approach was that it was done voluntarily, because the people who were in the position to make the change were at the table leading the process. That was probably the biggest piece. So it wasn't some top-down need to do it a certain way. It was a collaborative from the ground up partnership approach. And that's what helped get it off the ground and make it be successful. And it was working with people that typically you might not think are on your side. So often when it comes to industry and environmental NGOs talking about a particular issue, you kind of expect that they're going to butt heads. And the process that we took, consensus-based process that we took, set all that aside and said, let's just deal with the issue.
Let's deal with the issue with the right people and the people that have authority to make the decisions. We're at the table.
Well, it's interesting because it wasn't about government at all in that one. It was individuals doing it outside of government needs. So the government set a target, but the government often just gets in the way. And so this was an example of people working together to drive and push to achieve something. Government was at the table because they have some information to provide and they kind of help set the box around. But the decision makers were the people from industry and who were willing to work with this group across the table that typically they'd butt heads with.
Because they had built relationships.
That is a big part of it.
Yeah, okay, great. Any other examples off the top, any of you, where you want to talk about what worked really well in collaboration, partnerships in this field of emergency planning or drought planning?
Can you hear me all right? Okay. So I work in tenants. So one of my tenants is bring a brick, not a cathedral. And when we're talking about relationships, I think that really matters. And the example that I'll pull from and the approach that I took, I actually call it the Jerry Maguire approach to planning. Help me, help you, help me, help you. So the story I'm thinking of was Grand Forks. When I first arrived, we went around to all the different households because I wanted to meet with people and have them tell me what they need, tell me about what they had just experienced. And I thought that people were going to take us to the homes, show me their home, what they had lost. But the first resident actually took me to her barn and showed me where her horses used to be. And another resident showed me all the fences that had gotten torn down from the flooding. And then another resident took me out to her garden and she was like, just look how rich the soil is. This garden has been in my family for generations. Just look how rich the soil is. And there I was there for housing recovery, but they were talking about all these things around it. So I learned all these really amazing stories, but what was I going to do with that, right? Like, how was I going to turn that into action? So we came up with that vision statement that I shared with you earlier, and we actually invited anyone that we could think of having even the slightest role or investment in the rebuild of Grand Forks into a room, and we shared 3 case studies without sharing names, and then we shared the vision, and we did our research, we understood their mandate, we understood what contributions they could make. And we said, okay, how can you help? And we kept on asking that question of every single person in the room. And I have to say, enthusiasm is contagious. As soon as one partner was like, you know what, we can come and we can assist with physical labor. We'll bring our teams and we'll sort out our own accommodation, but we need help with building materials. And someone's like, well, you know what? We can donate some building materials. And it just snowballed. It had traction. And I don't think I'll ever forget that particular meeting. I'd say that was my most successful moment in multi-agency collaboration and relationship building.
Thank you. Yeah, you humanized it, told stories, and then people really felt it and they wanted to volunteer to help after that. Yeah, thank you.
Yep, okay. I don't work well with others, so I may not be the right person to answer this question. What I find honestly, and if I have a piece of advice, it's that what has worked for me is that if you think you're an expert, stop talking and start listening. And while you're listening, start thinking about how what you know can connect with and contribute to what someone else is saying.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I was gonna meant to say that I'm not I think EPCOR can do better, honestly, if I'm going to be totally frank, at collaborating externally. But I do have an example for me, how that kind of realization came to be. In 2016, we had a near river flood event that took out both of our water treatment plants. The river quality was very, very poor, and we were not able to treat the water. And so for a couple of days, and no one in the city probably even realizes it, but we weren't treating water, and our reservoir levels were just slowly dropping and dropping and dropping. And I was in charge of the 2 water treatment plants at the time, and it was a very stressful situation. And I said, okay, we're gonna have to call demand management here because we are not able to get our plants back online. And so we reached out to our regional customers and said, we're calling demand management. And they said, okay, what level? We're calling a B, we're calling voluntary demand management. Okay, no, sorry, all I said at the time was B, we're calling a level B. And they said, okay, level B, sounds good. So, but the problem was, and we had worked together with our regional customers to build our protocols. However, what was B to us was different, meant something very different to them. So they called a mandatory measure in the regional system, and we were calling a voluntary. Now, in the big scheme of things, we ended up getting the plants back online very quickly after that, and so there wasn't a huge impact in the community. But just that confusion, you know, you need to, if you are developing plans and collaborating with others, you need to speak the same language. And so right after that incident, we got together with our regional customers and we rewrote our procedures to make sure that we were saying the same thing. But that was a really important learning to us at EPCOR, and it was, and to me personally, but also it just showed me we had these plans in place for years and never implemented them. And when we needed to, they weren't correct, if you will, because we weren't saying the same thing. So that was just a really good learning for me. And I think that we continually need to do a better job collaborating externally.
Can I jump in on that? Great. So thanks for that. I didn't know that actually, and I've lived here my entire life, so that's good to know. But I'm glad to know you guys, you handled it, you nailed it. So good job. You landed the plane, which is good. So we had another incident recently where an intake pump failed, and it was pretty significant. We had water use restrictions within Edmonton. So I'm just wondering, like, what have you learned from those recent incidents, or what plans are in place at EPCOR to respond to sort of unexpected disasters, if that's too strong of a word, maybe?
Yeah. So again, that was a real eye-opener learning opportunity for us. So what Andre's referring to is in February, we had a major pump failure at our E.L. Smith water treatment plant, which is the bigger of our 2 water treatment plants. And we were unable to push any water from that plant out to the city. And that was had a huge impact because we weren't sure how long it was going to take to get that pump station back up and running. So we did have to call mandatory demand management measures at that point. It's also the winter time. So you don't have, you can't ask people to stop watering their lawn because nobody's watering their lawn. So we weren't even sure what kind of a reduction we were going to get by calling the mandatory measure because we'd never actually done that in the winter before. Communication wise, we learned a lot that we need to do better. And we are looking at how the communication went, and there's a big root cause analysis being done as well to make sure that that incident never happens at our plant ever again. There's a ton of learnings, and we're still going through it right now. We're still sorting through it all. So I don't have an answer on what we're going to do next because we are still really sorting through all that. And it was, we never want anything like that to happen again because, we want to be able to provide water to our customers all the time. But obviously these things, our system isn't as resilient, I think, as we think it is. at times.
Right, thank you for that, because you addressed some of the questions that had come up on the Mentimeter, and there was another one about risk assessments for EPCOR's infrastructure, like you had talked about how you planned for floods because you're in the river valley, but what about heat waves and high winds and all of that?
Yeah, we have done a number of risk assessments. We do have a climate adaptation strategy that it does have risk assessment built within it on our infrastructure. And right now we're delving more into wildfire risk and drought as well. We have put a lot of efforts on flood, and we've got a pretty robust plan there. But yes, we do have plans, risk assessments.
Okay, good, thank you. And I was taking notes when you were all talking for our key takeaways report that we'll be working on around collaboration and relationships and listening and using the same language and humanizing your story. So I'm going to capture all of that. There was a question I thought that some of the folks in the room might want to know about. As climate adaptation planners, what do we need to know and understand to best include and engage with emergency services departments? So sometimes the climate adaptation planning happens in the environmental department, but the emergency planning is happening in the fire department. And so have you seen some examples of what works, or is there any advice for some of the adaptation planners here?
Just a quick comment on that. I think it's pure happenstance that emergency management is often found within the fire departments. When we think about it, and when we think about the framework that I walked you through, it seems like something that would make a lot of sense in the planning department, actually. I said earlier that pieces of risk management go everywhere. It's like an explosion, right? So I would say treat it as such. As every pocket of your organization, there are risk and emergency management activities, and those need to be coordinated. So yeah, that's all.
Thank you. And Tim, did you have anything on that?
I have nothing intelligent or otherwise to say about that.
Okay. Okay, anything?
If I can jump in for a
Oh,
second.
thanks,
So
Andre.
in Alberta anyways, the Alberta Emergency Management Act stipulates that all municipalities, whether they be small towns, villages, or like counties, they all have to have, it's mandatory that they have an emergency management contact. And then so that person's responsible for being the liaison between the province and I think other municipalities as well. So that would be a place to start. I'm not sure if it's included in intermunicipal plans. That those contacts have to exist, but because emergencies know no borders, that would make sense to me. I think they probably would have thought of that in developing that act. So that's a place to start. Is your municipality has to have one person identified to be the emergency management link.
Lead. And so talk to them in your municipality and go from there. Yeah, thank you. Well, Tim, you might like this question. It's directed for you. Have you seen successes where Indigenous knowledge on cumulative effects was sincerely considered and respected? And have you seen progress in this field over the years?
I would say that I've definitely seen, I guess you could call it progress. I mean, things have changed, right? And some of the conversations that I was, talking about with, sort of two-eyed seeings and people making at least acknowledgement that there are different ways of understanding things and trying to reconcile that, even with all of the sort of shortcomings that can play into that. I think that's progress. I mean, I have seen some really, to me, the most interesting stuff that's happening on cumulative effects is happening within sort of the Indigenous world. To me, that's where a lot more interesting and exciting things are happening. Not to go after Alberta, but Alberta has not done a lot on this issue. It's kind of like a deliberate ignorance, sort of see no evil, hear no evil, and Ottawa has not done a lot better. And so I find that, to me, cumulative effects and cumulative effects management is a space. It's a huge opportunity for Indigenous governments because non-Indigenous governments have done such a poor job in this area, right? And that's for a lot of reasons, like impact assessment is done in most places on a project by project basis, right? And Alberta has tried to implement regional planning systems, but there's only 2 of them and they're not great, and so I think there's a real opportunity for Indigenous governments to take the lead in this, because knowledge of this kind of stuff is going to be power in negotiating with governments, whether it's in courts or at the negotiating table. And so the most interesting things that I'm seeing happening are being led by Indigenous people. And I think this is a real place where there's an opportunity for Indigenous governments to really take leadership and show the rest of this country how you can think about this and do these things in a different way.
So there's your example of what works well. So thank you for that. I think we'll leave it there.